Well, happy Monday. Welcome back. We are in the Word. Today we're looking at the storms and pigs in Matthew 4, Mark 4:35 to 5:20. Storms and pigs. Interesting stories here about Jesus' ministry. I think the main takeaway is going to be that there's no safer place to be except serving Jesus. We're going to develop that in the story about the storm. I'll just touch on the pigs if I have some time left at the end. But both of them are pointing in the direction that the safe place for us to be in our lives is with Christ and serving Him. Let me read 35 through 41, just 6 verses here, and it'll put us into context here. It says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them," this is Jesus saying to the apostles, "Let us go across to the other side." So they're going to go across the lake of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, to the other side, to a Gentile region, surprisingly. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" Well, what's happening is they've gone out to the lake. Now, the Sea of Galilee is I think it's like around 600 feet above sea level, and it's surrounded by mountains. So you have this flat valley, basically, surrounded by mountains. There's a temperature inversion between them, and this causes a lot of wind, and this is typical at night. If you live in Estes Park, if you've visited Estes Park, particularly in the fall or winter, you know that we're in a similar situation in Estes Park. We have a valley, the Estes Valley, surrounded by high mountains all around us. And the difference in temperature often generates very high winds, especially in the fall and the winter time. I'm talking about 50 mile an hour sustained winds and 60 to 70 mile an hour gusts in Estes Park. Not to mention what's happening on the mountains around us. So very similar situation here. If you're a resident of Estes Park or either a permanent resident or visit here part of the year, you can relate to what's going on here. But this seems to be way beyond the normal windstorm. Keep reading with me in verse 39. Well, let me just go back to verse 38. They say, "Teacher, don't you care that we're perishing?" Remember who's saying this. These are men who are skilled and experienced on the Sea of Galilee. They have seen storms, and they think that this storm is bringing their lives to an end. "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' Some say, 'Hush,' or 'be muzzled.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." Well, you imagine the impact that it had. Jesus just spoke a word, and immediately the wind stopped. Sometimes in December and January, I wish I could do that here in Estes Park. But Jesus just spoke a simple word, and immediately the storm came to an end. It doesn't end there. Jesus turns to them in verse 40. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who is this then, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So let me just point out a couple things here back in verse 40. Verse 38. Let's start there. It says, again, these experienced fishermen are facing an incredible storm, and they ask Jesus, "Don't you care?" Well, by now we know, of course he cares. Jesus has been part of, he's become man in accordance with the prophecies that were made. So we have the incarnation of Jesus. This involved his humiliation, laying aside his deity in some sense, to take on humanity and submit himself to not only the will of God, but the worst that man could do. So we have the incarnation, the humiliation. We see already in our readings the growing opposition to Jesus. This we know is going to ultimately result in his rejection and his crucifixion. And the disciples ask him, "Don't you care?" Of course he cares. Of course he cares about us. He cared about the disciples, but he cares about us. Jesus turns to them after he calms the storm and is somewhat incredulous, asks them, "Why are you afraid?" Well, you can answer it quickly, I think, recognizing that this was a severe storm, possibly from demonic origin. Why not be afraid? But it's Jesus asking the question, "Why were you afraid?" In other words, he could have simply said, "Why are you afraid when you're with me? Why are you afraid when you know that we are on a mission that God has ordained from eternity past and will not be completed in my lifetime? Why are you afraid to go on with me knowing that the mission stretches out before you, that God's not going to sacrifice you, he's not going to leave me in the grave, because in that way, if he did that, his mission could not succeed. It could not be successful." And this kind of fearlessness that Jesus is calling his disciples to have here, "Why are you so afraid? Have you no faith?" shows that fear and faith are really incompatible. They're like oil and water. They just don't mix. When you try to mix them, they ultimately separate. That's what happens with fear and faith. Faith and fear are ultimately incompatible, and we see as a result really fearlessness in the apostles' service to Jesus. Consider the apostles, for example, in Acts chapter 5, verses 40 to 42. If you recall, they had been healed a lame man, went into the temple and preached. They were taken captive by the temple guard, brought before the Sanhedrin, beaten, flogged, and then released. And then what was their response? Did they cower? Did they run away? No, they went right on, it says in verse 42. Right on, preaching and teaching. They would not be dissuaded. They knew that God's plan was going to be worked out no matter what. So they weren't fearing for their lives. Jesus had told them they have life eternal. It's not to say that they might not have difficulty. Obviously they do. But there's no reason to fear. We see it again in Acts chapter 14. In this case, Paul has been preaching. And the result of his preaching was people dragged him out of town and stoned him, they thought, to death. Could you imagine the scene of Paul being rounded up, dragged out of town, tied to a stake? The religious men of the city, the Jews, would pick up stones and stoned him to death. They thought he was dead. And what did Paul do? As the crowd dispersed, as he was revived by those who were with him, he came to his feet. He went back into the town. Now, I might have been tempted to run away. I might have been tempted to hop in the first train and get out of there. Not Paul. Like the apostles, even in the face of abuse, he's fearless. We see it again in Acts chapter 16. In this case, Paul had been imprisoned with Silas in Philippi. And as part of his imprisonment, he was beaten. And God released him. He caused an earthquake. They were released. The jailer became a Christian along with his family. And they were ministering to Paul. And the next morning, you think Paul would just up and leave? He and Silas just hit the road, get out of town? No way. What does Paul do? He sends word to the very government officials that put him into jail and beat him, and he demands that they come back and release him as a Roman citizen. How fearless. How fearless. So, we see that with the apostles here on the Sea of Galilee, with the expanding church and Paul and Silas and the apostles, that for some people, service to Jesus will require that they give up their safety and security, even in some cases their health, coming near to death. But that doesn't mean they ought to fear. They're not driven by fear. They're not cowered by fear. They're not held back by fear. Well, we risk much less. No one's standing at our door ready to take us to jail for preaching the gospel. No one is going to stone us or beat us. They may call us names. They may look at us strange. They may think we're weird. But what do we risk? We risk some leisure time when Jesus calls us to serve him. We have to give up some of our leisure time and invest it in service in his church. Maybe it'll be involving TV watching or scrolling through Facebook. We'd have to give that time up and put it aside. Perhaps disappearing into the black hole that we call YouTube. I've done it myself, to start watching one YouTube video and watch one after one, another after another after another. Maybe you have to give that up. Maybe you have to give up scrolling through pictures of our family and friends on Instagram. Whatever it is, whatever that sacrifice we have to make, there's no reason for us to fear. We may be inconvenienced, but no reason for us to fear, because we know that whatever is done in Christ's name, whatever is done for his church, will succeed according to his word and according to his will. So don't be afraid, brothers and sisters. We see this later in the section in 5:1 through 20 on the demoniac, how he went from being a demon-infested, crazy person living in tombs to a man who sat quietly at Jesus' feet and became actually the first missionary to Gentiles. A man who was fearless once released from his demons. God bless you, brothers and sisters. I pray that the Lord would make you bold, make you fearless in your service to him and to his church. God bless you.